Hi, I'm Deanne Sesker, the Education Coordinator for the Iowa Lions Eye Bank in Iowa City, and we're here today with Ruth Fisher in Kalona, Iowa. And Ruth is our first Executive Director for the Iowa Lions Eye Bank, and she was the Director for 27 years. So we're going to learn a little bit more about Ruth and her role as the Executive Director for the Eye Bank. Tell us a little bit about how you got started in eye banking.
Well, it was rather a coincidence. I'd been doing MCC relief work in the Far East for a number of years, and when I returned home, I knew that I needed to be seen by an eye specialist because I'd had a serious eye problem. And living only 17 miles from Iowa City, it was the best thing to do was go to the Department of Ophthalmology at the University Hospital, which I did. There I met Dr. Braley, who was formerly from Lake Mills, Iowa, who had gone to New York City, and while there, he had learned how to do corneal transplants. He came back as a head of the department in Iowa City and introduced corneal transplants to the state of Iowa. He told me that I had keratoconus and the only way I could be helped was to have corneal transplants. Well, this was a very frightening idea, but when he assured me that it would be my only chance to keep from becoming blind, I had no choice. So I was put on the waiting list, and since there was no organization, no way of getting donor eyes, it took some time, and they had to come from another state because there had not been a law passed in Iowa to make this possible. Finally, one day, Dr. Braley asked me if I would go with him to a Lions Club meeting in Iowa City. It would be a luncheon, and I could just sit there and enjoy eating lunch, and I wouldn't need to do anything. I thought, well, this was the least I could do for what he'd done for me, so I went. But at the close of his talk, he said, now if any of you would like to come up and look at Ruth's eyes, I'm sure she won't care. The room was full of men, and of course they all decided to come up and look. And that was my introduction to the Lions Clubs of Iowa. And later that summer, he asked me if I would come and work for him as the eye bank director. I didn't really want to do this because I was so tired of visiting the hospital. But I felt that I would need to, and I said I would, but I thought 1 year would be enough. Well, as it happened, I stayed 27 years. And that was mostly because I really enjoyed the work. But my first day, which was September the 13th, 1955, when I walked in, I don't know exactly what I expected, but I know I expected at least to have a desk. But all I was given by Dr. Braley was a shoebox. And in it was some pens and pencils and paper, some information about eye banks and donor cards. He explained that there was no space empty at this time and that I would need to go from one desk to another, just wherever I could find an empty space in the eye department. So for 3 weeks I did this. Quite a bit of the time was spent in the library. I read whatever I could find about eye banks, but there really was not much material because I learned the only eye banks that were organized were in New York, one in New York City and one in Buffalo. And they were very new. I also tried to make a list because Dr. Braley would talk to me occasionally during these 3 weeks, and he'd say, now, there are a lot of things we need to do, and you know what we need. We need to get donor eyes, and you'll have to decide how we're going to do this. Well, I wasn't very accustomed to anything like this, but I had to try to think, and I knew that we'd need help with people, and probably the thing we'd need most would be some publicity. But how do you make people willing to donate their eyes, which they're not going to give you until they die? I mean, it's not a real easy thing to introduce to people. But we then had the national group. There weren't very many eye banks at that time, but the doctors realized that there should be an organization in which the corneal surgeons would be involved, other than just in the academy. And so they had a meeting of about, I think there were 11 people, and they represented 6 eye banks in 1955. And this was just a very unorganized meeting, and they realized that, but it was the beginning. And from then on, they started in '61. There was a meeting in Chicago, and this was at the time of the academy. And there were more doctors involved there, and they then decided that they would need to have something. They didn't know what they would call it. The meeting in Las Vegas in '62 was the time they decided it would be the Eye Bank Association of America, which it is today. We had a Midwest meeting. Dr. Braley again was the one that thought this would be a good idea. Then we could, in our little group, decide what we wanted to take to the EBAA, which was important, because they did decide that the EBAA would just be a way of bringing together all the eye banks. But aside from the medical ethics and a few things like that, they wouldn't have anything that everybody needed to follow. You could have your own way of doing things, which was a good idea, for states do differ and their laws differ. At that time they decided that there needed to be communication, better communication. How were you going to let people know that you had eyes available or that you had an emergency? We'd been using telephones, but that's very slow and not very good. Well, Dr. Braley and Ted Hunter were both ham radio people and very involved in this. And they decided that the ham radio people would like to have a part. I think Dr. Braley was one of the few doctors who was a ham radio operator, and he was a very enthusiastic one. He would get up early every morning to get on that net. And they had 2 times a day, morning and evening, after they began to become a part of the eye bank program. And they would meet at 7 in the morning, and I believe it was 6 or 7 in the evening, our time. And of course time varied over the whole United States. And they began to have this eye bank network. At first there were around 60 people, ham operators, who were very interested. And we had a Midwest meeting in Indianapolis, to which they decided, this was 6 months after the hams had started operating, they decided to invite all the ham operators to come to this eye bank meeting. And I think that was really an important thing. They came, they brought their wives, and they were very involved in the meeting. And they asked lots of questions and learned what the program really could do for people. About that time, Ted Hunter, well, it was at the Indianapolis meeting, too, that Ted Hunter presented the eye bank, the storage container with which the eyes are sent. And I believe the same container is used today. So it has remained very popular.
Another thing that was instrumental that was provided by the Iowa Lions Eye Bank is that you established such a successful program that you helped other eye banks get started. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, there were two ways that you did that. Occasionally, some of the people would come to Iowa and stay for, several of them stayed for about 2 weeks, or not 2 weeks, 1 week. Ann Conachon came from Oklahoma City, and someone came from Oregon. They came from a number of different, and then in other places they'd ask me to come.
One of the other things that you are noted for is writing the official definition of the eye bank, of what an eye bank is. Could you tell us how that happened?
Well, Dr. Braley came into my office one day with this letter request from the encyclopedia company asking for a definition of an eye bank. And he said, now you know better than I do what an eye bank really is. And he told me to get busy and write it and have it ready by a certain time. And I did.
And it's still being used today.
That's what I've heard.
And what do you see different? What do you think is a positive change? What do you wish they would have kept as you had done business?
Oh, I don't know. Because, you know, things have changed so much. And now they don't need to use a network because they have computers. Well, there's something you lose in a computer, of course, because you don't have the personal contacts. I would say the personal contacts that I had are something they can no longer have. I always met the patients. When they were being put on the waiting list, they came to me. I put them on the waiting list. And I got to have the personal contact with the people, which I know Pat, the present director, misses. And sometimes it was good, and sometimes it was discouraging, because not all the surgery is a success.
Was Dr. Braley the only physician that you worked with at the Iowa Lions Eye Bank?
No. He was the medical director of the eye bank until he retired from the department. And then Dr. J. Kratchmer came to the department and took his place. But I must say, I worked with almost all of the doctors in the department in some way or the other. But the medical directors of the eye bank were those. And Dr. J. Kratchmer was very active also. In a way, he had some of the same personality that Dr. Braley did, in that he was very interested in many things.
Could you give us a few thoughts about your career with the Iowa Lions Eye Bank?
It's been very worthwhile. It's been something that I've really enjoyed. But of course, not every day was enjoyable. And there were sad moments too. When you had a real reason for asking, I had letters afterwards from the people thanking me for coming and giving them this opportunity at a time that they were feeling very sad. So I think in this kind of a program, you want to be able to do that, to think about the good you can do for others by helping them regain their vision.